All right, well, good morning. We're going to actually be looking at the book of Daniel. So if you want to get to Daniel chapter 2 is going to be the first passage we're going to look at. So if you've got your Bibles, you're welcome to turn there, and we'll kind of get going on that. I don't know, last week, I've enjoyed hearing Josh and Josh just going through Ezekiel and Jeremiah and Isaiah as well. And so this week we're kind of moving into Daniel, and I just thought it was funny. Last week, Mendoza was up here, and his sort of closing statement was something along the lines of, eschatology it's not that scary, and he said something along the lines like, it hasn't really gotten weird, and my brain immediately went, not yet. Daniel's a really interesting book, and I know for speeches they always say you're supposed to have a really good attention getter, and that's my backdrop, but the easy part about Daniel is the attention getter is just pictures of some of the beasts that he talks about. So just to pique your interest a little bit, we're going to talk, I say briefly about a lot of this. Daniel has a lot in it, and we are certainly not going to have time to do like an exhaustive study of every link, every cross-reference, every fulfillment. But the goal this morning is really to focus more on the things that are unique about Daniel in reference to eschatology. So in a minute here, we'll look at a slide that has some of the prophecies that Josh squared, that they've talked about. And so the reason we're going to look at them in the beginning is as we're going through, you're going to have to make some connections of like, oh, I see. And then at the very end, we'll kind of make a connection of this is what Daniel talks about. And then these are sort of the connections to the prophecies that we've already seen. And so really looking at it again, there is a lot of imagery, but also a lot of really important information in Daniel. And I do say this, that obviously this is going to be more of like an umbrella overview. And the goal is really to just make it a little bit less maybe intimidating, because Daniel is kind of an intimidating book, quote unquote. But there is some interesting facts about it that I think even moving into it will help with that. So again, just a really, really quick overview. When you're looking at the book itself, the author is Daniel. Really, you should say the author is God through Daniel, because God's the author of all Scripture. So, but Daniel's the human author. You could throw Nebuchadnezzar in there for the chapter about his conversion. But anyways, Daniel really, the audience is Israelites in exile. But the thing I really want to highlight is the reason why this book is written. That there was a purpose in it, not just trying to give future information, whatever the case may be. But actually, if you study it, the reason that that this book was written or recorded was actually to encourage exiled Jews by revealing God's plan for them. So there is a key theme of God's sovereignty in the book of Daniel. You could actually add sort of God's deliverance and sovereignty, but sovereignty is really that key thing that we're locking into. And the reason that I highlight the idea of encouragement it's a lot of times we think of eschatology as something that's really intimidating. It's just kind of maybe confusing and in some ways a little bit frustrating because it's like, I don't understand. And actually you see Daniel come to that a couple times. There's a few verses in here. I joked, was talking to my dad about some of what I was working through, and I said, there's verses in Daniel I think I've never connected with more. At the end of like 7, 8, and then I think 10, he's just like, I just didn't understand, and I had to sleep for a few days. Like he's just, I was like, I kind of connect with that a little bit. But this idea, though, that it is written to encourage, and I think it's just really important as you're going into this book, that prophecy was actually given as a means of hope and encouragement to people that were suffering for their sin in exile. And the point wasn't to add confusion or intimidation. It was actually, in a sense, a message to the Israelites saying, God is still in control, and God still cares about you, and God still has a plan. And I think that's really important as you're actually moving into the book itself, because it kind of helps you put the right lens on when you're looking at this. It's really easy to get maybe overwhelmed by some of what he talks about and just kind of like, I'm just going to hop over this, or I'm just going to skim read, or whatever the case may be. But it is important to understand his goal was to be an encouragement to the Jews who were in the process of that 70-year captivity in Babylon. And so as we kind of move forward into this, just to give you again, just sort of a really brief connection. This is actually, I really just recreated a slide that Josh had last week. Just doing a really good summary of what we've talked about in Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. So you have in Isaiah these elements of the suffering servant must come. God is going to judge the whole world. The Messiah is going to reign on the earth. Jeremiah, again, the kind of ideal David is going to rule over Israel, kind of a reference to the Messiah again. Israel is ultimately going to prosper in the land, which we're going to see some of that come up today. This new covenant as well comes back up a little bit in Daniel. And then Ezekiel, a peaceful return to the land, new hearts and God's Spirit, and then a new temple being built. Now, again, we're looking at this because what we're going to do is I'm letting you look at it now. We'll kind of work through some key elements of Daniel. We're starting in 2 briefly just because it lays an important foundation for chapters 7 and 8. But as we get through 9, 10, 11, and 12, so we should be done by about 1 o'clock or so. I'm just kidding. I will stop at 9:45-ish. So, but as we're looking, I'll stop around there. It'll be fine. Positive thinking. But looking at this, I want you to kind of have this in your brain as we're working through some of it, because I'm not going to have necessarily the time to make every connection, but I want you to see it now because we're going to make a reconnect at the very end. So I promise my last slide has some connecting points to what we've already talked about as far as Daniel is concerned. So when you're looking at Daniel again, what's really important when you're looking at these prophecies is that he actually connects these in a really unique way, actually in a way that almost no, you could say any other like eschatology passage does, because he actually takes a lot of the prophecies that we talked about. He doesn't really add much in general, but what he does is he puts it in a little bit of like a time frame or a sequence, which is unique to some of the Old Testament prophets when dealing with end times. So again, we're not talking about date setting. We've already talked about that. There's plenty of people who've tried to do math and do weird numbers and try to come up with a date from Daniel. That's not what we're talking about. What we're saying is, and really we're referencing the 70 weeks, which we'll get to, he takes these promises and sort of puts them in a sense like a chronological order of just like this is kind of the sequence that they're going to happen in. Again, not doing date setting, but just kind of giving almost like a framework to this information that we've already been given. So in a sense, it's just like taking a bunch of 2x4s and putting them together to frame out a house where you're like, oh, okay, I see all the pieces. Now I kind of see the direction that we're moving. That's basically what Daniel does. What's unique again about him is that he is putting it in that sequence, which isn't really something that happens with a lot of these guys. So we're going to start in chapter 2, like I told you. Again, I'm not going to give all the details and information of the background. The short version, just remember, chapter 1 is kind of that introduction that Daniel's kind of probably about a teenager when he's taken into captivity to Babylon. And then chapter 2 is just this dream with Nebuchadnezzar. Again, we're not going to get into all the details just so we don't run out of time. But I'm actually looking at verses 44 and 45. And just remember, this is, again, I realize I'm making some of these kingdom connections that I have up there. I do actually want to point out that later on in some of these other visions that connect, angels like Gabriel actually tell Daniel, yeah, this is Persia, this is Greece. So a lot of them you don't have to guess on in the sense that it's in Scripture, it tells you who represented what. So I'm just giving you this image, but again, what you kind of have is that idea of again, these different sections of this statue representing different kingdoms or different historical kingdoms. Now, these kingdoms will eventually be taken over and judged by God himself, which then he's going to establish his own kingdom after that. So you see kind of this statue that he describes, and then towards the end, you have this rock that destroys, kind of comes out of nowhere, destroys the statue, and grows into a mountain that fills the whole earth. So looking at verse 44 and 45 in chapter 2, Daniel says, in the days of these kings, so talking about the end, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms. So this is a reference to God's judgment over all these earthly kingdoms and then power over them. And he says it shall stand forever. Verse 45, inasmuch as you saw that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God has made known to the king what will come to pass after this. The dream is certain, and its interpretation is sure. So as you're looking at chapter 2, this is, so just so you know the format a little bit, as we're looking at some of these chapters, what I have on the screen are like the key verses for Daniel chapter 2. So if you're a note taker and you want to kind of go back and see how these all go, I'm not going to read all the verses in each of these. But again, if you're just interested, these are sort of the key verses in each chapter as we're kind of relating it to eschatology. So we just looked at 44 and 45, but 36 to 45 is that, I say, key chunk of verses. And this basic point is that all earthly kingdoms rise and fall, but will ultimately be judged and ruled by God. So as we're kind of looking at that basic premise for chapter 2, we immediately get this image, and this is what's important as we're moving forward, and we're going to jump all the way to 7 and 8, is there is a reference to God's kingdom, or the Messiah's kingdom, that is literal. When he's talking about all these literal earthly kingdoms, there is a connecting point of God's kingdom being a literal kingdom on earth as he defeats and consumes these other kingdoms. And so that's one element of Daniel that is actually a theme that runs through almost every prophetic chapter. So that's one of the things we're actually going to be highlighting in addition to a few others. But that's one of the most unique aspects of a lot of his prophecies is there is this highlight of, I say historical kingdoms and then a connecting point of a literal kingdom that's ruled by this coming Messiah, who has a few other titles. Actually, as we look at chapter 7, which we'll do that in just a second, you have like the Ancient of Days and some of this other information that ties to the Messiah. But this is the basic point starting in chapter 2. All earthly kingdoms rise and fall, but they will all ultimately be judged and ruled by God. Now, as you move into chapter 7, so we're taking a pretty huge leap forward. As you're looking at chapter 7, it's actually after chapter 4, but before chapter 5. So if you're looking at like the historical timeline, chapter 2 is pretty early on in Daniel's life and ministry in Babylon. But as you fast forward, remember chapter 4 is the humility of Nebuchadnezzar, and chapter 5 is the fall of Babylon to the Medo-Persian Empire. And so before that happens, but after kind of Nebuchadnezzar's humbling. And in this vision, and this is kind of one of the first where it gets, I say buckle up a little bit, fasten your seatbelts, whatever. It's not that bad. So that was supposed to be a joke. Nobody laughed. I'm going to keep going. These are the four beasts that Daniel talks about. You have a lion with eagle's wings, which that's actually, again, it is Babylon. He kind of communicates that in the chapter. That's kind of the easiest one, though, because if you study Babylonian history, their palaces actually had statues of lions with eagle's wings on them. So that one's like, that one for Daniel was like, oh, that's a softball one. I got that one. And then you have this big bear that has 3 ribs in its mouth, kind of representing the Medo-Persian Empire and the kingdoms that it defeated. Again, you're like, okay, bear with ribs in its mouth. I can handle that. And then it's like, and then there's a leopard with 4 heads and 4 wings. And it's like, what is going on? So it escalates quickly. And then again, you have this just wild monster that doesn't really have any connection to anything as far as we know. It's just this dreadful beast. And then you can't really see it on this one, but then there's like a horn that's coming out of its head that has like a man's face. And this is where I'm like, this is what that's where you start to go, this is a little strange. There's a man horn growing out of this creepy monster's head, and okay, what is going on? So we're at Daniel chapter 7, and this is chapter 7, verses 17 to 22. And so basically 17, it just says, those great beasts, so this is after the vision has been given. And actually, just to give a little bit of clarification, I'll have a slide here in a second. What's really helpful with some of these is you have a vision, and then you have the interpretation, where it's like, here's the vision. It seems a little like what is going on. But what's really helpful is as like the second half of the chapter, Daniel is actually given, this is what this means. So you don't have to actually do a lot of guesswork where you're like trying to figure stuff out. And that's one of the sort of fallacies that you'll see people fall into is they'll kind of hop over the interpretation that's actually given in Scripture and try to be like, but they left out all these mystery numbers. Like I think, remember Josh talked about that in the beginning. If I can't remember who did the intro. You notice how I just said Josh? And I can't be wrong. So I think it was Mendoza, right? You did. Yeah, okay, see, that was like, I was 60% there. But anyways, but it is like a lot of people do that in Daniel. And they completely hop over the section that says, hey, Daniel, let me tell you what this means. It's like, okay, it's right there. So you don't really need to go, crazy. And so what you have in that second chunk, In chapter 7, it's verses 15 to 27, as he's literally given the interpretation of the visions that he just saw. So verse 17, those great beasts, which are four kings which arise out of the earth. So each beast represent four kingdoms that rise out of the earth. There you go. Verse 18, but the saints of the Most High will receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, even forever and ever. Then I wish to know the truth about the fourth beast, so this is Daniel speaking, which was different from all the others, exceedingly dreadful, with its teeth of iron, its nails of bronze, which devoured, broke in pieces, and trampled the residue with its feet, and the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn which came up, before which 3 fell, namely, that horn which had eyes and a mouth, which spoke pompous words, whose appearance was greater than its fellows. I was watching, and the same horn was making war against the saints and prevailing against them. So again, he's kind of looking at these, and the angel kind of tells him, each one represents an earthly kingdom. He's like, I can handle that. I just got one question. That last one is kind of freaky. What's going on? So he kind of like asked for a little bit more clarification on the super weird one, which I think any of us would. And so this is what it says, 22, until the Ancient of Days came, and a judgment was made in favor of the saints of the Most High, and the time came for the saints to possess the kingdom. So in Daniel chapter 7, let me give you this slide while I'm reading this. So Daniel 7, these key verses, it's clarification on future kingdoms and rulers that will persecute God's people. But again, you notice this same phrase, but they will ultimately be judged and ruled by God. So in chapter 7, you have 4 beasts that arise that represent 4 Gentile kingdoms. A divided kingdom rises from the 4th kingdom, so that's that weird beast there at the end, which eventually produces a single leader that uses his authority to make war against God's people, and he promotes himself or sets himself up as a god. Now, we didn't talk about this, but this is why I said writing down these key verses is going to be helpful, because it does talk about how this process is going to occur for approximately 3.5 years. Then God himself will come to deliver his people, and afterwards will establish his kingdom. So you saw from chapter 2, there's just sort of this, God's kingdom is coming and he's going to rule everyone. And now you have a little bit more information of, okay, but what's kind of like happening between then and God's kingdom? And it is sort of this rise of leadership. There's somebody who leads some sort of heavy war against God's people. But again, you come back to the same conclusion at the end of 7. They will ultimately be judged and ruled over by God. And that's where you have the Ancient of Days, this reference to God and to the Messiah. So the word, and again, verse 27 it actually should be 17 to 27. So I apologize if you wrote those down. It should be chapter 7, verses 17 to 27. But in verse 27, the Hebrew there, dominions is empires, like world. And then when he talks about the dominions will serve and obey God, serve and obey is kind of this idea of governing. So again, that's kind of where we're getting some of that connection. But I do just want you to notice that echoing from chapter 2 of the rise and fall of kingdoms, and even though there's going to be a heavy persecution of God's people, those people are going to be delivered from that. And that's where you see sort of that humility and that restored spirit. So again, he's tying in some of these prophecies that we've already talked about. And then it ends with God's kingdom. And so we're going to move into chapter 8, I say semi-briefly, and we're kind of pull this up so you can just see it all at once. What we've already looked at is the statue. You've got the 4 beasts, and then what we're about to look at is this ram and this goat that we'll just look at in just a brief second here in chapter 8. But I just want you to see this before we kind of get into 8, is how all of these visions from chapter 2, chapter 7, and chapter 8 are all connected in different ways, but still kind of representing the same thing. Or at least I say it's like the same thing from a little bit different perspective. So as you go into chapter 8, you have a ram who has 2 horns that represent the Medes and the Persians. And again, when you're reading the interpretation part, so in chapter 8, verses 1 through 14 are the vision, and then verses 15 to 26 are the interpretation. And I'll have a slide that has all that information up right after this. But again, just as you're looking at some of this information that I'm sharing, it's in the interpretation part. Like he says, the ram is the Persians, the goat is Greece. So he does clarify that in that section. So again, you have the ram with two horns that represent the Medes and the Persians, and it's seen moving, conquering west, south, and north. And again, if you know the Medes and the Persians, they're on the east, so they can't necessarily move more east. They're in the east, and they move north, south, and west. So again, makes geographical sense there. And then you actually have, this is tied to Isaiah 45, verses 1 through 7. They give, it's given 150 years previous to this, is tied in as well. So then you have a goat that represents Greece, moves in quickly from the west, and has one large prominent horn. Now again, I realize I'm doing a lot of like leaping, but again, if we kind of have the benefit of, history, of studying history and how this all connects. And again, you'd have to remember from Daniel's perspective, all of this is future. But you do have this one horn, that's Alexander the Great. And actually this goat, when you first see it, it's like flying. It's like a flying goat with one horn. It's not even touching the ground. So that's where you're like, okay, a ram, got it, and a flying goat comes out of nowhere. Well done. It's so it gets a little interesting there. But again, the whole point here is he rapidly comes in, conquers the Medes and the Persians, and then it says that this horn breaks and it grows into four horns, which are the four sections of the divided Greek Empire. And we'll have a map that actually looks at that as well just in a minute. But again, just trying to get to the core here. So another little horn arises after that, and it's prophesied to be a persecutor of God's people, but eventually will be judged by God and then kind of ruled over by God. So this is chapter 8. Again, these key verses, 16 to 26, focusing on the interpretation of the vision. It says, in the future, again, from Daniel's perspective, an evil ruler will govern all earthly kingdoms and persecute Israel severely, but will ultimately be judged and ruled by God. So you have this sort of consistent theme in chapters 2, 7, and 8 of these rising and falling kingdoms and a lot of rulers that are stepping in. So looking at chapter 8, just to kind of give you what he says, this is chapter 8, verse 23. He says, in the latter time of the kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their fullness, a king shall arise having fierce features who understand sinister schemes. And then it goes down at the end of 24, he shall destroy the mighty and also the holy people. Through his cunning he shall cause deceit to prosper under his rule, and he shall exalt himself in his heart, and shall destroy many in their prosperity. And then he shall even rise against the prince of princes. But then it says, but he shall be broken without human means. Again, kind of getting into this idea of judgment. So that's where you have that, again, that yellow phrase at the bottom, kind of wrapping it all back up from what he's talked about. So just to kind of give you a quick overview, because I know it's a lot. Chapter 2, you have the vision in 26 to 35, and then you have the interpretation of that vision in 36 to 45. Chapter 7 there, 1 to 14, and then the interpretation 15 to 27, and then the chapter 8 one in there and is there as well. And you have really two key takeaways. Again, there's a lot of tie-ins that you could have, but we are trying to just keep an umbrella overview of what he's talking about. And there is this element that God's kingdom is a literal kingdom, at least in part. And I say in part because remember, there is a sense of restoration in their hearts, a new covenant. There are spiritual aspects to God's kingdom, but it is really important to recognize that Daniel does emphasize earthly kingdoms. And there is, again, that's one of the points that he's hitting in these three visions. And then the interpretation that is given to him by God through angels. And then 2, Israel will be persecuted, but they will ultimately be delivered by God before his kingdom is established. Now again, this is tying in a lot of the prophecies that we've seen from Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel that does have, remember, dwelling peacefully in the land. There's a restoration, there's a healing, there's a deliverance. And so that all ties in. But again, remember we talk about like the sequencing. Daniel does establish that persecution and the deliverance of Israel happens before the establishment of this kingdom. And so as we shift forward into chapter 9, there's, again, quite a few here. So what I'm going to do is we're going to look at some of these sections briefly. We're actually not really going to look much at 10 and 11. 1, because of time, and 2, just because there's so much involved in them that I don't want to, it's not fruitless, obviously, but we're trying to stick with this umbrella overview. And so I'm putting these up here if you want to write them down as I'm working through some of these key points of the next 4 chapters, because they are obviously really important. But again, just for the sake of time, making sure that we get to our conclusion of making sure we understand how Daniel connects to what we've already talked about. So that's really what we're going to prioritize. But as I'm working through this, I'm going to leave this up. There's a few other slides I'll show you, but I'll make sure that this stays up. So if you would like to write them, they are up there. Okay, so this is chapter 9, and this is the Daniel's 70 weeks. So again, we're not going to do an exhaustive dive into this section, but there is actually one key takeaway that is important from this sort of time section or sequencing that's given. And again, we're not talking about time as in date setting. We're just talking about sequence. He talks about sequence, okay? So verse 24, this is Daniel chapter 7. He says, 70 weeks are determined for your people and for your holy city to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Verse 25, now know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. And again, we're not going to get into the nuances of it, but just the short version is every week represents 7 years. So 1 week is 7 years. So there you go. That is what it. Again, we'll look at it on a separate slide, but just kind of giving you this time frame: 7 weeks and then 62 weeks. And he says the street shall be built again, and the wall even in troublesome times, referencing that first section of 7 weeks, which would be 49 years. And so then after this, 26, after the 62 weeks, Messiah shall be cut off, it's killed, but not for himself, and the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. So you have here the Messiah being killed, and then the city and the temple are going to be destroyed. The end of it shall be with a flood. Until the end of the war, desolations are determined. Then, this is verse 27, he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. So he is referencing that leader, that one kind of this political leader or whoever is going to rise. He's going to make war against, let me see, he's going to confirm a covenant with many. And again, many is a reference to Israel for 1 week. But in the middle of the week, he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering. Now, if you keep going through the chapter, it kind of ends the same way. Judgment and deliverance kind of thing. But there's something that is really important when you're looking at the sections of 7 weeks, the 62 weeks, and then the 70th week, that he has at the end of the 62nd, or I guess the 69th week, that the city and the sanctuary are destroyed. But then when you look at verse 27, he says that there's going to be an end to sacrifice and offering. And this is where I say at least verbally going to make a connection to the new temple being built that was kind of mentioned last week. In order for the sacrifices to stop, the temple has to be rebuilt. But what you have is the temple, the sanctuary being destroyed, and then all of a sudden they're cut off. So there is sort of this time gap that is referenced between 26 and 27, where kind of this new temple that we've talked about has to be rebuilt. So the temple has to be rebuilt so that they could start and then stop. And that's kind of, again, reference to Ezekiel's new temple. Now, chapter 10, again, we're not going to dive into it. It is a really interesting chapter if you're studying like angelology, where there's basically the reality of spiritual warfare. There's just some information that Gabriel shares that's really interesting, but he basically just tells him there was a spiritual battle, that's why I was delayed, but now I'm here. That's chapter 10, basically. So we don't have time to dive into it. Chapter 10 is really interesting. It does contribute to what comes in 11 and 12. But again, just trying to stick to some of these key principles. The one other thing I wanted to make sure we hit in chapter 11. So this is Daniel chapter 11, verses 2, 3, and 4. He says, now I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings will arise in Persia. So this is where, again, this is not the first reference, but it is getting to this. He's being told these things represent Persia, these things represent Greece. So 3 more kings will arise in Persia, and the 4th shall be far richer than them all. By his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Greece. Verse 4, then a mighty king shall rise, who shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will. And when he is risen, his kingdom shall be broken up and divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, but not among his posterity or his own lineage, nor according to his dominion which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be uprooted even for others besides these. And this is where I just want to throw up, again, remember all of this is future to Daniel's perspective, but if you're a history nerd like me, some of these historical connections are just kind of fun. But if you notice, this great king is going to rise out of Greece. He's going to die. He's not going to have family to pass on his kingdom, so it's going to be divided into 4. And if you look what happened to the fall of Greece after Alexander the Great died, his kingdom was separated into 4 kingdoms. So that's historical fact. Now, 11 is a really interesting chapter that if you're studying chapter 11 and historical fulfillments of prophecy, you're going to be in it for a long time, because there are an incredible amount of historical prophecies fulfilled given in chapter 11. In fact, chapter 11 of Daniel is one of the most sort of like critiqued and questioned of secular scholars, because they're like, there's no way this was written back then. Like, it's so accurate and so clear to what has happened in recorded history, they just reject it. Now, the short version is the manuscript record proves that. It wasn't added later. It's always been there, so we know that. But chapter 11, if you're a history nerd, is a lot of fun to study. Now, I'm going to move again to chapter 12, because this is really important when you're getting into it. But chapter 12 is this sort of conclusion. So I'm not going to read really any key verses from chapter 12, just because I really want to make sure we get to this kind of closeout slide. But as you're looking at Daniel chapters 9 tied in, and then 10, 11, and 12, in Daniel 10, so remember, 9 is the 70 weeks. Daniel in chapter 10 has a vision of the Messiah, and as he hears him speak, he falls down before him in humility and reverence. Then the angel Gabriel shows back up, explains why there was a delay to getting to Daniel, and then clarifies the reality of spiritual warfare, specifically within nations and world powers. So it's more than just earthly things going on. There are spiritual battles going on as well that we just don't see. In chapter 11, God gives Daniel a vision that spans from the events of Daniel's near future all the way through the end of all earthly kingdoms, as God judges and defeats all of those kingdoms. That bleeds into chapter 12, where God promises that Israel will be delivered from these persecutors, from these evil world rulers, and other demonic attacks. This time frame is made up of 2 3.5-year parts, and again, this is all in chapter 12, so some of these key verses kind of direct you there. But it's made up of 2 3.5-year parts, and it's split by the desecration of the temple, identified as the abomination of desolation in Daniel. At the end of those 7 years, Israel will humble themselves. So now we're getting into the restoration that we've kind of talked about, and dwelling peacefully in the land. God delivers them, judges their enemies, and then establishes his kingdom. I'm going to put this, so that's kind of, again, Daniel 9 through 12. The temple and the city are going to be destroyed and rebuilt. The Messiah will come and be killed. God's people are going to endure severe hardship and betrayal, but the Messiah will return to judge and to rule the earth. Now, I'm putting this up here. I'm not going to leave it up super long. This is just taking the information in Daniel 9, and it ties in information all the way through 12, and it just puts that sequence in a framework. So you notice I have not put any dates on there, because if I was, you should run me out. There's nothing. This is just the information that he gives and the sequence that he lays it out. So I know the font is really tiny. If you're really interested in it, I can send it to you. I just stole it from somebody else's PowerPoint. Borrowed it. I didn't steal it. Borrowed it. So if you, again, but this is just the information that he gives, and it lays it out in the sequence that he does, or that he does it in his own. Now, we say all of that, and I realize, again, it's kind of like drinking from a fire hose. And I had this kind of picture in the background, and it kind of, this idea of mountain peaks, and you can't really see the valleys in between the mountain peaks. Now, normally, if I was in Virginia, like before I moved out here, I would have to explain what this looks like. But for you guys that live out here, all you have to do is jump on the 15 and drive towards like LA, and you get this idea of seeing mountain peaks without understanding the gaps between valleys. So one of my favorite views out here is if you go through Barstow, you go past like the outlet malls, and then the highway kind of goes straight, and then it drifts right. And right as you drift right, all you see is mountains, and you've got one here, you've got kind of a range back here. And actually right now, or at least 2 weeks ago, some of the snow on the top of the mountains near LA, like you can see them way in the distance. And this is kind of what you're getting from the perspective of Daniel. He's stepping back, and he's just seeing a lot of mountain peaks, Persia, Greece, and he can see in the distance, not that like the mountain of LA is God's kingdom, but just visually. Okay, we're not going, one of those is like, don't do it. So metaphorically, okay, in the sense he sees this big thing in the distance, but what you can't see from that perspective, even though you can see these mountain peaks, you can't see Apple Valley, you can't see Victorville, you can't see Costco, it's not that big. You can't see that gap in the civilization and all this stuff in that valley between those mountains, I don't even know what mountain it is, I should have looked it up. And then the ones outside of LA, I still don't know what they're called. I just moved here-ish. I didn't. It's been 7 months. I should know by now. But the whole point is you get that visual of seeing mountain peaks without being given all the information. Daniel is not a comprehensive view of human history. He's not describing every single event. He's not describing everything that's going to happen, every detail. He's stepping back, and he's seeing mountain peaks without being given clarification of time frame, of distance, of dates, none of that, just kind of mountain peaks. And so as I move through that, these are the key takeaways that I want to have, and I'll try to keep them up as I'm talking because I know it's the first two, you're like, okay. The last one I realized is pretty wordy. The last section in yellow, all it is the connections of the prophecies that we talked about in the beginning. So I was going to try to get it on multiple slides. I realize I probably should, but I made an executive decision, and I'm just going to leave them up while I talk. So the first point, and this is sort of the key takeaways of Daniel's prophetic visions. And that first one is this idea that the kingdom of God is a literal kingdom. If you look at chapters 2 and 7, and really chapter 8 as well, but also kind of these literal historical connections to prophecy in chapters 11 and 12. There is this emphasis from Daniel's perspective that the kingdom of God is a literal kingdom. Now again, that doesn't mean there aren't spiritual aspects to that fulfillment, because as we've seen, this restoration, a new covenant, a new heart towards God, there are spiritual dynamics to God's coming, but in the end, his emphasis is on a literal kingdom. So that's kind of one of those important, again, I say the reality of historically proven fulfilled prophecy, and I just wrote this, it should cause us to take unfulfilled prophecies very seriously. From Daniel's perspective, all of these things were future, and we can look at human history and go, whoa. So from his perspective, they're future, we see it, but I know from our perspective, it ought to make us go, if there's still unfulfilled prophecy, we ought to be taking that just as serious as Daniel was taking this. The second key takeaway is that Israel will be humbled, they'll be delivered, and then they'll be restored after a time of severe persecution. So in this, we also find that the people and the kingdoms of this world will also face a severe time of judgment sometime in the future before this restoration occurs for Israel. So this is where you get some of the 70 weeks and then some of the information tied in those other ones. But again, this is this sequence of there's going to be a time of judgment in the future for these earthly kingdoms before Israel is finally restored and God's kingdom is set up. This last phrase, it's just kind of a summary, trying to put it in a little bit of a sequence in one sentence-ish. It might be a run-on, but I'm not going to worry about it. It says, again, you can see it there, but the idea here is that the Messiah will come, but he will be cut off or killed, and eventually the temple and city will be destroyed again. But the new temple will be built, and the Messiah, called the Ancient of Days, will come again and judge Israel's enemies. He will deliver and restore Israel and then establish God's kingdom over the earth. So as you're kind of seeing this again, these references to the new temple, this ideal David, this Messiah and the Davidic lineage, there's these connection points to being dwelling in the land peacefully and even having the land and all those different things. So I have some of those connections at the bottom. Now that's all I've got. So not the smoothest conclusion, I guess. But I do hope that it's helpful. That was kind of one of the things I wrote was my goal was to just try to keep it simple. And I realize it's a lot of information. And but when you look at Daniel and you look at what he emphasizes, there is this reality, and we go back to this theme of God's sovereignty and God's deliverance, that no matter what it looks like, God is always in control, that our salvation doesn't depend on a political leader who is or isn't elected. It isn't dependent on the rise and fall of earthly kingdoms. It's dependent on God, and that should be extremely peace-giving because the world ebbs and flows so much. But Daniel is a reminder that God is in control no matter what it looks like to us, and that God will deliver his people. In a sense, you could say God wins. That's how it ends. And Daniel gives us that from a really unique perspective. But again, also, he kind of uniquely puts it in a sequence, unlike really anyone, especially up to this point in prophecy. So that's really what we can learn from Daniel's prophecies. If you have any questions, we don't really have time, but you can ask me later, I guess.